how are people actually deploying and using explainability methods more generally? We found that nearly a decade of explainable AI research kind of ended up only in service of data scientists and engineers and not in service of transparency goals. And so the question is, how can we surface that information to end users with respect to large language models?
Welcome, everyone, to the AI Governance Podcast, where we discuss practical approaches for responsible AI practitioners. My name is Shankar, and today we are excited to have with us Umang Bhatt. Umang is assistant professor at NYU's Center for Data Science, a senior research associate at the Alan Turing Institute, and a leading researcher in the fields of AI explainability and transparency. Welcome, Umang, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Var. It's great to be here.
So for our conversation, I would love to start with AI use in organizations, and then we can zoom out a bit and look at a more global perspective. So just starting with organizations, within organizations, AI explainability is a major characteristic of responsible AI. And one of the issues with large language models has been the difficulty in understanding and explaining why a model outputs certain information. And before an organization can explain this information to users and to end users, data scientists and engineers need to be able to interpret it. So could you share with us how you see organizations approaching explainability for the public, interpretability for their own experts, and just focusing on large language models?
Yeah, definitely. I think this has been a large characteristic of some of my research. One of the things that we've studied quite a while back in the context of AI systems is responsible AI principles who are becoming popular was how are people actually deploying and using explainability methods more generally? And this was pre-LLMs, but it's still necessarily true for LLMs themselves. We found that nearly a decade of explainable AI research kind of ended up only in service of data scientists and engineers and not in service of transparency goals. There were a bunch of tools which became very popular, like Lime or SHAP, which are publicly available repositories for explaining black box machine learning models. And they became really popular amongst data scientists to validate what was important within a machine learning model. And the idea was that you had these large neural networks that were then being approximated by some simple model that we knew how to interpret, whether it be like a linear regression or a logistic or something interpretable. Now, the issue is that as organizations kind of felt the pressure to share information with the public, I really saw that there were two classes of transparency that started to emerge. The first I like to think of as procedural transparency, which is the socio-technical ecosystem around a machine learning model, or even a large language model for that matter. And the other is algorithmic transparency, which kind of tries to understand the innards of the model itself. And really, if we think about it, end users and the public, they might not have requirements for algorithmic transparency in many contexts. Like knowing which features were important is somewhat helpful if there's available recourse, but in practice, this might be a validation mechanism where you might not change anything. It might give you some sort of happiness. I like to think of this example that one of my mentors told me. It's when we have a machine learning model, and I tell you, we used it in a diagnostic setting, and it was meant to predict if there was a malignant tumor or not in a particular scan. If the prediction was there is no malignant tumor, your first question is, how do you know it's not? You kind of want some sort of attribution, not for recourse purposes, but you kind of want some sort of like algorithmic information about the system. I would argue that, and we've argued about this in our work, is you might even care about uncertainty as a form of transparency, where you actually need to tell me that how certain are you that this is the actual prediction. So I'd actually cast a lot of our interpretability and explainability discussions around large language models in that same vein. It was like, can we get well-calibrated uncertainty information from these systems? But if the prediction is yes, the information you require is not like, how certain are you? Your head goes completely somewhere else to thinking about your family and your kids, and actually thinks about the socio-technical context in which you've deployed this system, which is not that transparency information is not important. It's by understanding the socio-technical ecosystem of what workflow a model is being deployed in. And so the question is, how can we surface that information to end users with respect to large language models? So what we're actually starting to see is kind of a push towards kind of understanding uh, where large language models are deployed more generally. Like, this kind of goes back to a lot of like the documentation work that Microsoft and Google had done back in the day around data sheets and model cards, kind of understanding system cards is I think what Hugging Face has been calling it for a while. Uh, Kind of being able to surface that information up to the public. And then machine learning experts might not be able to do the same type of interpretability they were with classical machine learning models anymore, because they doing linear approximations might be somewhat meaningless. But there is some merit in being able to have oversight into the features that models are using, and this has kind of been known and studied under the auspice of mechanistic interpretability in the AI safety community. And I think this is a laudable, viable path forward. I do think that with respect to the way organizations should approach explainability, they ought to think about why would they even choose to surface information about the model in the first place? And can they use that knowledge of that particular information to decide when to use the model at all? And I think this kind of dovetails nicely with a lot of the interesting work we're doing now and we're seeing around refusal of using particular agents in specific settings. So you might have autonomous agents, but what are the workflows when we decide not to use those systems? And can we be transparent about that a priori?
Yes, it's a great point. So, we know that one way that organizations have sought to make LLMs safer is to restrict what they're allowed to output, or who is allowed to use them, or what they can be used for. So that's kind of the governance. And in a recent paper, you've called this algorithmic resignation. So what do you see as the benefits of it, and how can it be used as a complement to other responsible AI strategies like adopting principles and training employees?
Yeah. I'm really excited about this direction of resignation, of understanding when we resign the use of an AI system in favor of human judgment. And and I do think you said that you hit the nail on the head saying that we want to use this to complement existing responsible AI strategies that you'll have at the organizational level. And the reason we call this resignation is that in some sense, for a very long time in the machine learning community, we had this notion of selective prediction and deferral, where we would choose not to use a machine learning model because the model was going to be very uncertain on the input at hand. Okay, so my model is not necessarily sure what's going to happen. Let's just not use it and kind of come up with some base case of what to do. And in the era of large language models, we think that this information might this type of framework for deferral, for selective use of an AI system, doesn't necessarily just have to depend on model specific information. It might depend on your organizational policies, on authentication information that you have around certain employees within your organization having the security clearance or the ability to use particular agents at specific times because they have the right training, or there's certain regulations that are in place. There's a large variety of information you'd want to put into a particular policy that would decide when an agent is used or when a large language model is used. And resignation tries to surface both learned information of when agents and AI systems are helpful to people, and when you have specific rules that you have in place in your organization for when systems ought to be used. So we've kind of started implementing and coming up with new mechanisms for sharing this with the public, kind of thinking about what would it look like to adaptively identify when AI systems are helpful, subject to whatever responsible AI principles you have within your organization, which can be kind of implemented into a policy for selective access to an AI assistant, which we think is a very, very promising direction for companies going forward.
Yeah. So, organizational context, as you said, is just so key in the implementation of large language models and other kinds of AI. And when we think about governance, we also always stress cross-functional collaboration. But work with any organization, and you'll see that people already have a lot to do at work. So, how do we capture some of that organizational context in the form of feedback from everyone involved in buying, developing, or deploying an AI system to kind of better understand their pain points as well as potential operational and ethical risks and benefits.
Yeah. No, I think this is so key because we don't want to end up in a world where we've left people behind with respect to their feedback on the use of an AI system. One of the things that we've advocated for, and this was work that we'd done in collaboration a while back with the Responsible AI Institute, we come up with a new form of documentation called a feedback log, which tried to log the information that various stakeholders had about the use of an AI system. But the real question that we had is like not just coming up with a log of who had given certification or approval for the use of a system. We're more interested in what feedback was given and then what tangible changes did we make as a result of that feedback. Because that's where the buck generally stops. We generally find so many people providing opinion and feedback on AI systems more generally, but you rarely find people closing that loop and saying, okay, as a result of your opinion or your feedback X, I made these 5 changes to the oversight procedures I have, or we put this compliance framework in place, right? How can we close that feedback loop to better catalog and log when you made changes to your system workflow as a result of the feedback that people had? So we're really excited to see some organizations start to implement this kind of workflow where it's kind of a little bit more systematic, where it's like a pain point was raised, and here's the one way you can address it, and here's how we chose to address it. One of the fascinating things is this lets you kind of weigh various changes one could make, because one piece of feedback might have like 5 or 6 different changes, or might be at odds with other pieces of feedback you've gotten from other stakeholders within your organization or outside of your organization. So you can kind of have a broad overview of that if you're using a kind of centralized mechanism to collect the feedback and then decide how and where to implement the feedback that's given to you. I think one of the things with respect to procurement is what kind of procedures do you have in place for testing and for what recourse do you have in place for when procurement potentially goes wrong, and whose liability, who will hold the liability for any errors that arise? I think those are kind of questions that will arise that will need systematic answers that only arise if you have feedback from multiple stakeholders.
Great. So before we move on from organizations, I just want to touch on a couple of topics that are on everyone's minds. Should we expect LLM performance to plateau or to exponentially accelerate in the next couple of years? And kind of relatedly, how do you see the structure of the space? Do you think a few labs are going to continue to dominate the space, or do you expect LLMs to become commoditized?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think we're going to see LLM performance exponentially accelerate to a particular point with respect to text alone. I think we're going to need to um, introduce a some other modality to kind of get even further exponential growth that we've currently seen. I think we'll definitely see large language models large language model performance and capabilities improve. One of the things that I'm wary of, though, is understanding how we can ensure the benefits of those large language models are kind of felt. I think it, in this sense, I do believe that might become commoditized. However, it may not feel that way because players like OpenAI and Google have the distribution power that other large language model providers don't, or other organizations will not. So I think it'll be hard to muddle, to kind of decouple, because it'll be very muddled. You'll have OpenAI and Google kind of deploying these tools at scale because they can, but other players can will have open source variants that are just as performant, but in practice their adoption is a little bit lower. And I do think that's the $1 million question, right? We'll have uh, I don't remember who said this, something along the lines of, the person who invented the refrigerator wasn't the one who made $1 billion. It was the one who sent a Coca-Cola in the fridge, right? So the question is like, how people deploy these tools will matter. And I do think that there's a long tail here of communities that haven't even felt the impact of like traditional machine learning models who might just jump directly to large language models, and then they'll come up with new, fascinating, fun use cases for AI within their communities. And it's hard from our ivory tower to understand and decide exactly what that impact will be.
Yeah, that's a really great point about, you know, something could still become commoditized, but the distribution channels might be controlled by a few big players. So, great. Well, let's move on then to the global outlook and some of the more societal issues. So, in organizations, we've seen LLMs, used for customer service, and in scientific research. In society more generally, scientific research has kind of emerged as one of the bright spots for the use of AI to automate and scale research. What are some other areas that you find promising and where you think that we should expect to see more positive impact across society from AI?
Yeah, I do think that the scale of scientific research, I think, is probably one of the most exciting directions here. I do think that there's a large scope for changes in personalized education. I think we've been kind of waiting around for a while for individual like tutorial-esque services. We go back to like Bloom's Two Sigma problem here, where we can kind of have one-on-one tutors that walk us through information. Now, I do think that there are a bunch of issues that arise in that setting as well, which will need to be addressed, particularly along validating information and like what does testing look like in this context. Those there are a bunch of things that need to be ironed out there, but I do think that the education system in America and all across the world is ripe for appending, and I think this might be uh, the key to the key to unlocking the next frontier of education.
Great. So you mentioned kind of expanding the scope of the conversation beyond the US. So responsible AI generally tends to be kind of uh, the conversation around it tends to be dominated by North America, the EU, and China. How can we get the rest of the world involved in a more meaningful way?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think this is something I've personally, for the last few years, been thinking quite a lot about. I think that one of the things that I've been very cognizant of is it would be very hard and rather colonial of us to assume that we can just show up with our responsible ad pillars in the global south or for the global majority and just assume that everybody will have those as well. So, can we train people from those communities to kind of get up to speed on what responsible AI procedures and practices look like, and can they then go off and deploy them in specific use cases within their communities? That is something that I've been very excited about. One of the ways concretely we've done this is there are large scale like uh, machine learning summer schools and AI societies that exist all over the global south. So one of them is known as Deep Learning Indaba. So for the last 2 years, we've run a responsible AI practical to kind of get 500 African machine learning scientists up to speed. So 2 years ago in Accra, last year in Accra, Ghana, last year in Dakar, Senegal, and this upcoming year in Kigali, Rwanda, we're running these workshops to kind of get communities up to speed on what AI safety looks like in the West and what would it look like within their community. So concretely, one of the things that we've also done is like think about let's just take pillars of fairness. You'd think that like our definitions of fairness might be applicable to use cases around in some of these communities, but in practice, like some of the racial questions that we've been asking in America might be less of a concern to some of those communities. And so I had a Ugandan student who kind of was pushing back on America's some of the focus that we've had on protected characteristics with respect to race in in the American education system around fairness problems. And it got me thinking about I would have never thought of that had I never been exposed to a student from Uganda who's very excited about that. Similarly, you have similar effects in Latin America. So we've run AI safety workshops and AI governance workshops in Brazil. And actually last week I was in Chile, in Santiago at Kipu AI, which is a similar organization to Deep Learning in Dalba that is championing Latin American uh, AI education, kind of thinking about similar topics. And I do think that once people from those communities are armed with the language that we've developed around AI safety and governance, they'll be able to go off and deploy them in specific contexts and use cases that they have in their communities rather than us kind of going backwards to kind of find them retroactively. So you'll end up seeing some really fun applications of that seems like this amazing work and keep you less weak on like noisy sensitive attributes, which is just like I might not have access to like your sensitive attribute information in Brazil. This is this Brazilian context. So what type of estimation questions can they answer? And then they'd kind of been applying this to medical problems with hospitals. And I just thought that to be like really interesting. And we definitely have some work on that uh, in the academic world, but to see it deployed in practice was really heartwarming and something that I didn't necessarily think was would have been possible had we just stayed confined to the West.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And as we have these conversations, it's so important to engage with people from around the world. And for our listeners from around the world, I would encourage you to reach out to Umang on any of the efforts that he's mentioned. Um, so, we talked about scientific research, we talked about education. Another area that we see governments in developing countries looking at AI to improve uh, kind of performance in is the administration of justice. And we see, Brazil's Attorney General's office is using ChatGPT for three things: to triage lawsuits, so to kind of organize the characteristics of each case and suggest strategies, to produce statistics about caseloads, and to summarize documents and kind of produce submissions on some of the lower stakes in some lower stakes matters. So when I hear about the use of AI in justice, my mind, just maybe from being trained as a lawyer, goes to everything that could go wrong. And legal services is one of the areas where, I would probably suggest moving slowest in adopting LLM use. But at the same time, I understand that, a lot of these justice systems are backlogged and understaffed, and AI can really kind of help the administration of justice. So I can see where they're coming from. So what's your take on how developing countries should approach AI use in the justice system?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and when you shared this with me, I kept coming back and forth because I don't necessarily feel I think there are two very important arguments here. One is making sure we get it right, and the other is making sure that we get it done. Because at this point, um, there are a lot of I think the backlog and understaffing might actually outweigh the potential for error, and there might be you might need like a large recourse system, so you might need a large staffed organization that kind of handles some of the error, like an error body, which kind of looks at like, okay, here are the we're going to be rather conservative in the summaries that we're going to check, for example, right? Or we're going to be rather conservative in like checking which the triage of specific lawsuits because we want to make sure we get it right. But I do think that it is going to potentially unlock quite a lot of uh, yeah, staff time to work on other problems that actually matter. So my take is that incorporating it thoughtfully is important, but also trying it out to see if it works, and not being hesitant is definitely my like prescription to organizations in this space. Uh, so I do think that like the question is it really comes around how you actually decide to what systems you decide to use. I think that's like an interesting question that like is probably one of that's a little bit more nuanced around do I decide to like what additional context can I provide it? I think that's why the legal services community, which has been notorious for being for it for its verbosity, uh, um, is kind of ripe for appending because there is so much content that's already out there. I think like scientific research is structured, which is why we're seeing progress being made there in the legal services world, and with writing and text generation, we're seeing progress improve so rapidly because there is so much content already that we can use to ground whatever we want going forward. So I do think that uh, AI use is probably important in sandboxes to start in governance, and then hopefully you can start to get safe deployment if you put proper recourse in place, which is likely just another bureaucratic organization to just check everything by hand for now. But I do think scalable oversight is a fascinating line of work that we're seeing in the academic world that will address this question head on. And hopefully we'll have an answer in the next 45 years. We probably need it sooner though. So
Yeah, yeah. Great. Well, that's all we're going to have time for today. So, Umang, we know that you were in Chile last week and are currently in Australia. So, thanks so much for joining us and for navigating those time zones.
thank you so much for having me. And yeah, feel free to reach out on any of these topics. And yeah, thanks so
Great,
much.
great. And with that, we'll wrap up this episode of the AI Governance Podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you next time.